The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 opened the largest land war in history. Operation Barbarossa, launched on 22 June, involved nearly 3.2 million German soldiers and over 600,000 troops from Axis allies advancing across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their objectives were ambitious: to destroy the Red Army in western Russia, capture key economic regions, and force the Soviet state to collapse within months. By late summer, the Wehrmacht had inflicted severe losses on the Soviet forces. German reports estimated 3.5 million Soviet prisoners taken between June and September, while Soviet sources confirmed catastrophic personnel and equipment losses. Yet despite these defeats, the Soviet Union remained in the war, mobilizing reserves and relocating industrial production east of the Urals. Moscow, as both the political capital and a vital transportation hub, became central to the strategic calculations of both sides. The city housed key government institutions, the headquarters of the Soviet armed forces, and essential rail junctions linking north, south, and central regions of the Soviet Union. Its population exceeded 4 million before the war, though evacuations and mobilization reduced the civilian presence. For the Germans, capturing Moscow promised decisive psychological and strategic effects: the disruption of Soviet command and control, the potential paralysis of logistics, and a symbolic demonstration of victory. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command, OKH, believed that Moscow's fall could break Soviet resistance before winter. For the Soviets, defending Moscow became both a practical and symbolic priority. Stalin and the State Defense Committee directed vast resources toward fortifying the city and organizing reserves. The Red Army, although heavily damaged by the summer defeats, sought to stabilize the front through successive defensive lines west of Moscow. Public morale in the capital reflected the tension. Evacuations of factories and government offices began in October, but Stalin himself remained in the city, signaling determination to resist. The operational situation leading into October 1941 was complex. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had advanced deep into Soviet territory, reaching Smolensk by mid-July. Yet the German offensive slowed due to overstretched supply lines and Soviet counterattacks. In August, Hitler diverted armored units from Army Group Center to support operations in Ukraine and Leningrad, delaying the drive on Moscow by nearly 2 months. This decision allowed the Soviets time to reinforce the Central Front and prepare defenses. By September, with Kiev captured and southern operations concluded, German armored formations returned to Army Group Center, setting the stage for a renewed offensive. Intelligence assessments on both sides influenced decisions. German planners underestimated Soviet reserves, assuming that the Red Army had been largely destroyed during the summer. In reality, the Soviets mobilized hundreds of thousands of new recruits and transferred divisions from the Far East once intelligence indicated that Japan would not immediately attack Siberia. By October, the Soviets fielded over 1 million troops along the Moscow axis, though many units were under strength and poorly equipped. Germany concentrated approximately 1.9 million men in Army Group Center for the final push, supported by over 1,000 tanks and 14,000 artillery pieces. The weather and terrain posed additional challenges. The autumn rains of 1941 turned roads into deep mud, slowing mechanized movement and complicating logistics. Rail lines required conversion from Soviet to European gauge, delaying supplies. Fuel shortages became acute as trucks sank in the mud, consuming large amounts of gasoline to cover minimal distances. These conditions eroded the speed advantage of German armored units. By late September, the stage was set for Operation Typhoon, the code name for the final offensive against Moscow. The German plan envisioned massive encirclements west of the city, destroying Soviet forces in the Bryansk and Vyazma sectors before striking directly at the capital. The Soviets prepared to resist with layered defenses, militia units raised from Moscow's population, and reserves drawn from across the country. Both sides understood that the coming battle could determine the outcome of the entire war in the East. Operation Typhoon began on 2 October 1941, with Army Group centers striking along a broad front toward Moscow. The German plan envisioned rapid encirclement battles to eliminate Soviet forces positioned around Bryansk and Vyazma, opening the road to the capital. The offensive was spearheaded by the 2nd Panzer Group under Heinz Guderian advancing from the south, the 3rd Panzer Group under Hermann Hoth, and the 4th Panzer Group under Erich Hübner attacking from the north and center, and supported by infantry armies following behind. The total force included around 1.9 million German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, and 1,390 aircraft of Luftflotte II under Albert Kesselring. The Soviet defenders, commanded by Generals Andrei Yeryomenko in the Bryansk sector and Mikhail Yefremov and Ivan Konev in the Vyazma sector, fielded approximately 1.25 million men with 1,000 tanks and 7,600 artillery pieces. Their forces were stretched thin along extended fronts, many divisions understrength due to previous losses. Soviet command believed that the Germans would attempt to push directly toward Moscow and underestimated the scale of the planned encirclements. The Stavka, under Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, issued orders for stubborn defense but lacked sufficient reserves to cover all approaches. The initial German breakthroughs were rapid. On 2 October, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group struck near Orel and Bryansk, cutting through the 13th Army and creating panic among Soviet rear units. Within days, German armored spearheads advanced up to 100 kilometers, exploiting weak Soviet defenses. In the north, Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group and Hopner's 4th Panzer Group broke through near Vyazma, bypassing Soviet strongpoints and driving deep into the rear. Luftwaffe support disrupted Soviet communications and destroyed supply depots, further weakening resistance. By 7th October, German forces had encircled large Soviet formations west of Moscow. At Vyazma, 4 Soviet armies, the 19th, 20th, 24th, and 32nd, were trapped, totaling around 600,000 men. At Bryansk, 3 Soviet armies, the 3rd, 13th, and 50th, were similarly encircled, with about 500,000 men at risk. German accounts claim to have created the largest encirclements in military history, dwarfing even Kiev. The Soviets resisted fiercely, attempting breakouts in multiple directions, but German reports estimated that within 3 weeks, more than 650,000 prisoners were taken, along with 100 or 200 tanks and 5,400 artillery pieces captured or destroyed. For the Soviets, the encirclements represented a disaster. Entire armies were wiped out or scattered, and the road to Moscow lay open. Yet the encirclements also delayed the German advance, as divisions were tied down, reducing the pockets. Soviet soldiers fought desperately within the encirclements, slowing German progress and allowing Stavka to rush reserves into defensive lines closer to the capital. The 5th, 16th, and 33rd Armies were redeployed under Zhukov's command to form a new defensive perimeter along the Mojaisk line, just 100 kilometers from Moscow. Civilian morale in Moscow reflected the crisis. On 15 October, the Soviet government ordered partial evacuation of ministries and industries, and panic spread through the city as rumors circulated of German troops at the gates. Trains and trucks crowded the roads eastward, while militia units formed from workers were dispatched to dig defenses. Stalin chose to remain in Moscow, broadcasting a message of defiance and personally attending parades on Red Square in November to demonstrate resolve. The opening phase of Operation Typhoon thus brought Germany closer than ever to its goal. Massive Soviet losses and rapid German advances suggested the possibility of capturing the Soviet capital before winter. Yet logistical problems, worsening weather, and the determination of Soviet command to defend Moscow set the stage for a longer struggle than German planners had anticipated. The initial victories created conditions for both German confidence and overextension, while for the Soviets, survival depended on sacrificing entire armies to buy time for new defenses. The strategic planning behind Operation Typhoon reflected both German ambition and underlying miscalculations. The German High Command, having achieved large encirclements at Kiev in September, believed that one final push could end the Soviet campaign before the onset of winter. Adolf Hitler emphasized the symbolic and strategic importance of Moscow, convinced that its capture would paralyze Soviet leadership, disrupt the railway network, and deliver a psychological blow that might force capitulation. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, shared this view and pressed for a direct strike. However, the planning underestimated both the scale of Soviet reserves and the logistical difficulties of sustaining a large mechanized force over hundreds of kilometers in deteriorating conditions. Army Group Center concentrated nearly 1.9 million men for the operation, supported by around 1,000 tanks and 14,000 artillery pieces. Yet supply lines already stretched back to Poland and Germany, relying heavily on rail networks that required gauge conversion from Soviet to European standards. The process slowed the transport of fuel, ammunition, and food, and by October, German frontline units were receiving irregular deliveries. Panzer divisions often reported having only 3 to 5 days' worth of fuel on hand, making sustained mobility difficult. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe, tasked with providing air superiority and logistical support, faced shortages of aviation fuel due to demands across multiple theaters. On the Soviet side, Stavka understood the seriousness of the threat but lacked clarity about German intentions until the offensive began. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses during the summer, but Stalin's government mobilized replacements rapidly. By late September, Soviet industry had relocated many key factories to the Urals and Siberia, ensuring a flow of weapons and vehicles despite losses in the West. Intelligence from Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy in Tokyo, indicated that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East in 1941, allowing Stalin to redeploy divisions from Siberia and the Far East to reinforce Moscow. These troops, well trained and accustomed to harsh conditions, would prove critical in the defense. The Soviet objectives were defensive and pragmatic: delay the German advance, preserve core forces, and hold Moscow at any cost. Stavka issued directives to build successive defensive lines west of the capital. The Mojaisk line, stretching through Kaluga, Maloyaroslavets, and Volokolamsk, was prepared with trenches, anti-tank ditches, and fortified strongpoints. Civilian workers and militia, numbering over 250,000 people, were mobilized to dig defenses. Propaganda emphasized the defense of the capital as a national duty, framing it as a struggle for survival rather than a conventional battle. Both sides engaged in extensive propaganda campaigns. German broadcasts and leaflets claimed that Moscow would fall within weeks, pointing to the encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk as proof of inevitable Soviet collapse. Soviet propaganda, by contrast, highlighted Stalin's speeches, the heroism of Red Army soldiers, and the determination of civilians to resist. The November 7th parade on Red Square, held even as German forces approached within artillery range, served to project Soviet confidence and to rally both domestic and international support. Strategically, the Germans misjudged the endurance of the Soviet state. They assumed that after the destruction of Soviet armies west of Moscow, resistance would crumble. In reality, Soviet mobilization capacity remained enormous. By late 1941, over 4 million men had been called to arms since June, with fresh divisions arriving continuously. The Soviet rail system, though strained, still functioned well enough to move reinforcements into the Moscow sector. Additionally, Soviet command benefited from interior lines of communication, allowing quicker redeployment between threatened sectors than the Germans could achieve with overstretched supply routes. The weather became a decisive factor in strategic planning. German commanders had hoped to complete Typhoon before the autumn rains, but the delay caused by earlier operations meant that by October, the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, had begun. Tanks and trucks bogged down on dirt roads, reducing speed and consuming excess fuel. German units advancing 10-15 kilometers a day in clear weather slowed to as little as 2 to 3 kilometers. Repair workshops were overwhelmed by mechanical failures caused by mud and cold. For the Soviets, the Rasputitsa provided valuable time to strengthen defenses and regroup retreating units. The mismatch between German strategic goals and logistical realities became evident within weeks. The initial encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk were vast, capturing or killing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. but the reduction of these pockets consumed time and resources. Soviet resistance within the encirclements forced German divisions to commit men and equipment that could otherwise have been used to press directly toward Moscow. As a result, the timetable slipped, and by the time German forces approached the Mojaisk line, the Soviets had reinforced the capital with new armies. Thus, the strategic planning of Operation Typhoon contained a fatal contradiction. The Germans sought a rapid and decisive victory, yet the operational methods chosen, massive encirclements requiring extensive logistical effort, ensured delays that eroded their chances of success. Soviet planning, while reactive and costly, capitalized on these delays to build defenses, mobilize reserves, and prepare for a protracted struggle. Both sides entered the next phase of the battle with clarity about their goals, but little certainty about the means to achieve them, setting the stage for the first direct clashes on the approaches to Moscow. The first direct clashes on the approaches to Moscow began in mid-October 1941, following the German encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. Although these pockets inflicted massive losses on the Red Army, they also consumed German time and fuel. When the spearheads turned east toward the capital, the Soviet High Command had already redeployed reserves to the Mojaisk defensive line, roughly 120 kilometers west of Moscow. This line, manned by about 90,000 troops supported by 1,000 artillery pieces and 90 tanks, was thinly held but reinforced by militia and hastily constructed fortifications. General Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed to command the Western Front, directed the defense, moving units rapidly to threatened sectors. The Germans, advancing with 3 panzer groups and accompanying infantry, sought to break through this line and drive directly toward Moscow. By 13th October, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group captured Orel, threatening Tula to the south of the capital. Hupner's 4th Panzer Group moved through Kaluga and Maloyaroslavets, while Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group pressed toward Volokolamsk. The 4th Army and 9th Army followed behind, securing the flanks and reducing pockets of Soviet resistance. German formations remained strong in manpower, but their tanks were showing wear from months of continuous operations. Mechanical failures reduced operational strength. Panzer divisions often had fewer than 50% of their authorized vehicles. For Soviet defenders, the situation was critical. At Volokolamsk, the 316th Rifle Division under General Ivan Panfilov, numbering about 11,000 men, faced repeated attacks by superior German forces. Their resistance delayed the German advance for nearly 2 weeks. At Borodino, site of the 1812 battle against Napoleon, Soviet units fought a symbolic defense, though they were eventually forced to withdraw. Around Kaluga, heavy fighting slowed German progress, with Soviet counterattacks buying additional time. These battles inflicted high casualties on both sides. German accounts recorded thousands of losses in men and vehicles, while Soviet reports indicated divisions reduced to a fraction of their original strength. The impact on civilians was immediate. Villages along the approaches to Moscow were evacuated or destroyed in the fighting. German occupation forces requisitioned supplies, contributing to shortages, while retreating Soviet troops implemented scorched earth measures, burning crops and dismantling factories. In Moscow itself, panic spread on 15-16 October when rumors circulated that the city would be abandoned. Crowds looted shops and crowded train stations, attempting to flee eastward. Order was restored only after the NKVD imposed martial law and reinforcements from Siberia began arriving. By late October, the German offensive stalled temporarily due to weather. Heavy autumn rains turned roads into mud, immobilizing vehicles and slowing resupply. Tanks required tow support to move, and fuel consumption skyrocketed. German divisions often advanced only a few kilometers per day, far short of operational expectations. This pause allowed Soviet forces to strengthen defenses around Tula, Klin, and Mojaisk. Stalin ordered the mobilization of over 250,000 civilians to dig trenches and anti-tank obstacles around the capital. New armies, including the 1st Shock Army and 10th Army, were formed from reserves arriving by rail from the east. Despite these reinforcements, the Soviets faced severe shortages of equipment. Many rifle divisions had fewer than 5,000 men and limited artillery. Tanks were often outdated models such as the T-26 or BT-7, though new T-34 and KV-1 units arriving from relocated factories began to appear in greater numbers. The German panzer divisions, though reduced in strength, retained tactical superiority in coordination and experience. The Luftwaffe, though limited by weather, launched bombing raids on Moscow and Soviet rail hubs, attempting to disrupt reinforcements. The first phase of the clash on the approaches to Moscow revealed both the effectiveness of German encirclement tactics and their inherent limitations. The destruction of Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk created space for the advance, but the time lost in reducing these pockets enabled the Soviets to organize new defenses. German armored thrusts reached within 100 kilometers of the capital, but could not achieve decisive breakthroughs against stubborn Soviet resistance and deteriorating logistical conditions. The battlefront settled into a series of localized engagements, each costly and exhausting, as both sides prepared for the next stage of the struggle. As October turned into November 1941, the Battle of Moscow entered a stage of escalation and crisis. For the German Army Group Center, the encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk had delivered tactical success, but at the cost of time and resources. The weather shifted decisively against them. The autumn Rasputitsa created roads of mud that trapped vehicles and slowed supply convoys to a crawl. The rapid advance envisioned by Operation Typhoon gave way to exhaustion and logistical bottlenecks. German panzer divisions, which in June had fielded over 200 operational tanks each, now often counted fewer than 70 serviceable vehicles. Mechanized spearheads consumed their limited fuel reserves simply to remain in place. Infantry divisions struggled to keep pace, and horses, still responsible for much of German logistics, suffered heavy losses in the worsening conditions. For the Soviet Union, the situation was equally dire. The Red Army had lost more than 2 million soldiers in the battles of the summer and autumn, with hundreds of thousands captured during October alone. Yet Stavka refused to concede the capital. Stalin declared that Moscow would be defended to the last, reinforcing the resolve of both soldiers and civilians. The Mojaisk defensive line, though breached in places, slowed the Germans enough for reserves to reach the front. Reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East, estimated at 10 fresh divisions, were deployed west of Moscow. These units brought with them cold-weather equipment and experience in harsh conditions, factors that would become critical as temperatures dropped. The city itself was transformed into a fortress. Over 250,000 civilians, many of them women and teenagers, were mobilized to build anti-tank ditches, trenches, and barricades around the capital. Factories continued operating despite air raids, producing T-34 tanks and artillery pieces within range of German bombers. The population endured rationing and blackouts, while militia divisions, often poorly armed, took up positions alongside regular troops. Morale fluctuated. Panic in mid-October had given way to determination by early November, reinforced by Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow rather than evacuate to Kuibyshev. German commanders recognized both the opportunity and the danger of delay. Hitler pressed for renewed assaults before winter froze the front, convinced that capturing Moscow would end Soviet resistance. Field Marshal von Bock ordered concentrated attacks toward Klin in the north, Mojaisk in the center, and Tula in the south. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army moved on Tula, but Soviet defenders repelled repeated attacks, forcing the Germans into protracted fighting that drained fuel and ammunition. In the north, German forces pushed toward Klin and Solnekhnogorsk, reaching within 50 kilometers of Moscow. Yet every kilometer gained demanded heavy effort against Soviet counterattacks and constant reinforcement of overstretched supply lines. The Luftwaffe attempted to tip the balance by intensifying bombing raids. Between October and November, German aircraft struck Moscow repeatedly, destroying rail stations, warehouses, and residential areas. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and the arrival of additional fighter regiments limited the damage, but civilian casualties mounted, with thousands killed or injured. The raids failed to disrupt the Soviet command system, which had largely moved underground or eastward, but they contributed to the sense of crisis within the city. International observers recognized the scale of the battle. British and American diplomats in Moscow reported on the determination of the Soviet leadership and the hardships of the civilian population. Allied aid, still modest in 1941, began to arrive through Arctic convoys and via Iran, providing aircraft, trucks, and raw materials. Though not yet decisive, these supplies strengthened Soviet logistics and morale by signaling external support. By the end of November, the crisis reached its peak. German armored units stood within artillery range of Moscow, with some reconnaissance detachments reportedly sighting the spires of the Kremlin from advanced positions. Yet the Wehrmacht was overstretched, suffering from frostbite, mechanical breakdowns, and dwindling supplies. Soviet forces, though battered, had stabilized the front with fresh divisions and fortified positions. Both sides recognized that the coming weeks, as winter descended, would determine whether Moscow fell or survived. The stage was set for the most intense phase of the campaign, where weather, endurance, and the will of armies and civilians alike would shape the outcome. The peak of the Battle of Moscow unfolded in late November and December 1941, when the German advance reached its closest point to the Soviet capital. Army Group Center, despite severe losses and supply difficulties, launched a renewed push toward Moscow, seeking to deliver the final blow before the onset of winter. Field Marshal von Bock coordinated three main thrusts. In the north, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups aimed at Klin and Solnekhnogorsk. In the center, the 4th Army pressed toward Narofominsk and the western outskirts of the city, and in the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army attacked Tula, intending to encircle Moscow from below. In total, about 70 German divisions took part in this phase, though most were under strength. The Germans achieved several tactical successes. In late November, the 3rd Panzer Group captured Klin, while the 4th Panzer Group seized Solnekhnogorsk, advancing to within 30 kilometers of Moscow. The 4th Army broke through toward Narofominsk, reaching the line of the Nara River. To the south, German units reached Kashira, threatening to cut the rail line between Moscow and Tula. These positions placed the German front line as close as 25 kilometers from the capital in some sectors. Artillery bombardments could be heard in Moscow, and the danger of the city's fall seemed imminent. Yet each German gain was costly. The weather had turned decisively against them. By early December, temperatures dropped to 20 degrees CU, later plunging below 30 degrees CC. German troops, still equipped in many cases with summer uniforms, suffered widespread frostbite. Horses froze in their harnesses, and lubricants in tanks and artillery pieces congealed, immobilizing weapons. Frost claimed more casualties than Soviet firepower in many units. Supply convoys could not deliver adequate fuel or food, and rations were cut sharply. Panzer divisions reported that fewer than 40% of their vehicles were operational. For the Soviets, the crisis was grave but not hopeless. The arrival of fresh Siberian and Far Eastern divisions, redeployed after confirmation that Japan would not attack in the east, bolstered defenses. These reinforcements, numbering over 100,000 men with full winter equipment, were concentrated in reserve armies under Zhukov's command. They were positioned to counterattack at the moment German forces became overextended. Soviet intelligence, including reports from partisan networks, confirmed the exhaustion of German formations. Civilian life in Moscow during this peak was defined by both fear and resilience. Air raid sirens sounded frequently as the Luftwaffe bombed rail lines and industrial plants. Residents endured freezing conditions, ration shortages, and curfews, while continuing to work in factories that produced tanks, artillery, and ammunition. The Red Square parade on 7th of November, where Soviet troops marched directly to the front, had reinforced morale. By December, the population understood that the city stood on the brink, yet also that preparations for defense were thorough. Anti-tank obstacles lined streets, and militia battalions manned defensive sectors. At the command level, German leaders debated whether to press further or halt. Hitler demanded continuation of the offensive, insisting that Soviet resistance was near collapse. Von Bock and his generals warned of the risk of overextension, but orders from Berlin compelled renewed assaults. In contrast, Soviet Stavka, led by Stalin and Zhukov, planned a coordinated counteroffensive for early December, timed to exploit German weakness and the arrival of reserves. By the first week of December, the German advance had culminated. Their forces were exhausted, suffering over 150,000 casualties since the start of Operation Typhoon, and their logistics system was collapsing. Soviet defenders had absorbed the blow, stabilizing the front with fresh troops and fortified lines. The peak of the campaign thus marked not only the Germans' closest approach to Moscow, but also the moment of maximum strain on their resources. The stage was set for the Soviet counterstroke that would reverse the course of the battle and mark the first major strategic defeat for the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. The failure of the German offensive to capture Moscow by early December 1941 created conditions for Soviet resistance and adaptation on a scale not previously seen in the war. As the Wehrmacht reached the limits of its strength, Soviet forces prepared to seize the initiative. Stavka, under Stalin's direct oversight, recognized that the German Army Group Center had become dangerously overextended. Its panzer divisions were depleted, infantry was exhausted, and logistical support had broken down under the combined strain of weather, distance, and attrition. Reports indicated that German divisions had in some cases fallen to 50% of their original strength, with frostbite casualties numbering in the tens of thousands. This presented an opportunity not only to halt the enemy, but to launch a counteroffensive that could restore morale and demonstrate the resilience of the Red Army. Preparations for this counteroffensive had begun even as German units pressed close to the capital. Throughout October and November, the Soviet Union mobilized its remaining reserves, transferring divisions from Siberia and the Far East. These forces included experienced rifle divisions, ski troops, and cavalry units trained for operations in harsh climates. The decision to redeploy them westward was made after Soviet intelligence, including the reports of Richard Sorge from Tokyo, confirmed that Japan did not intend to attack the Soviet Union in 1941. This allowed Stalin to release more than 20 divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft to reinforce the Moscow front. By early December, these units were concentrated in reserve armies positioned behind the Western Front, ready to strike at German flanks. The Red Army's adaptation was not limited to the use of reinforcements. New tactical doctrines emerged from the lessons of the summer and autumn. Rather than attempting to match German maneuver warfare directly, Soviet commanders emphasized the use of depth in defense, absorbing German blows and counterattacking once enemy spearheads stalled. Zhukov and his subordinates organized counterattacks with combined arms, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and cavalry to exploit weaknesses in German lines. The availability of the T-34 medium tank and KV heavy tank, both superior in armor and mobility to many German models, gave Soviet units a qualitative advantage when fuel and ammunition could be supplied in sufficient quantities. Partisan movements also played a growing role in disrupting German logistics. By late 1941, thousands of partisans operated in the forests and countryside behind German lines, attacking convoys, sabotaging railways, and cutting telephone lines. While their impact was limited compared to regular military operations, they contributed to the cumulative strain on German supply efforts, forcing divisions to divert troops to security duties. This indirect pressure aided the Soviets in preparing their counteroffensive by weakening the cohesion of the German rear. The psychological toll of the campaign was felt on both sides. German soldiers, many of whom had believed the war would be over before winter, now endured extreme cold without adequate clothing or shelter. Morale declined sharply as casualties mounted and the prospect of victory faded. Letters and diaries speak of despair, with men describing frostbitten comrades and stalled advances only kilometers from their objective. On the Soviet side, morale hardened. The defense of Moscow was framed as a national struggle, and the survival of the city became a matter of pride and determination. The November 7th parade held in defiance of German proximity symbolized this resolve. Soldiers marched directly from Red Square to the front lines, reinforcing the sense of unity between the state, the army, and the population. The counteroffensive began on 5 December 1941, timed with the onset of freezing conditions that immobilized German vehicles but enabled Soviet troops, many on skis, to move effectively over snow. The Western Front, under Zhukov, launched attacks north and west of Moscow, while the Kalinin and southwestern fronts supported from the flanks. In total, over 1.1 million Soviet troops participated in the offensive, supported by 7,500 artillery pieces, 774 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. They faced around 1 million German troops of Army Group Center, with fewer than 500 operational tanks and limited fuel supplies. The first blows fell north of Moscow, where Soviet forces struck at Klin and Kalinin, targeting the German 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups. German units, weakened and poorly supplied, were forced into retreat within days. The Soviets recaptured Klin on 15th December and Kalinin shortly after, driving the Germans back 100 kilometers. In the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, already stalled before Tula, came under heavy assault from Soviet armies and cavalry corps. By late December, German units were retreating from Kashira and threatened with encirclement. The Soviet counteroffensive steadily expanded, pressing the Germans along a broad front from Kalinin in the north to Yelets in the south. Soviet innovation was evident in the use of combined forces. Ski battalions raided German supply lines, cavalry corps conducted deep penetrations into rear areas, and tank brigades supported infantry in coordinated thrusts. The Red Army adapted its tactics to exploit the Germans' immobility and lack of winter preparation. In contrast, German attempts to mount counterattacks failed repeatedly due to inadequate reserves and fuel. Commanders at the divisional and corps levels reported difficulties even in holding defensive lines, as frozen equipment and exhausted men eroded their ability to resist. Civilian participation in the Soviet war effort intensified during this period. Workers in Moscow continued to produce tanks and weapons under severe conditions, often laboring in unheated factories. Women and children built fortifications, transported supplies, and supported hospitals for the wounded. The population endured rationing and shortages, yet the knowledge that German forces were retreating from the city boosted morale. Propaganda highlighted the counteroffensive as proof of the Red Army's strength and the inevitability of eventual victory. The adaptation of the Soviet state, military, and population thus transformed the Battle of Moscow. From a position of near collapse in October, the Soviets had reorganized their defenses, mobilized reserves, and launched a counteroffensive that turned the tide. The German army, which had believed it stood on the brink of decisive victory, now faced the reality of retreat in the face of a resurgent enemy. The battle demonstrated the importance of endurance, resource management, and psychological resilience. It also highlighted the limits of German blitzkrieg when extended into the depths of Russia, against an opponent capable of absorbing initial defeats and adapting rapidly. By the end of December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive had liberated hundreds of towns and pushed the Germans back from Moscow by 100 to 250 kilometers in different sectors. The crisis of October had been overcome, and the Red Army had proven its ability not only to defend, but to regain the initiative. Yet the struggle was far from over. The German Army Group Center remained a formidable force, and the coming months would see continued fighting along the Central Front. The Battle of Moscow, however, had already marked a decisive turning point. The Wehrmacht's first major strategic defeat, and the emergence of Soviet resilience as a factor that would shape the course of the war. The turning point of the Battle of Moscow unfolded through December 1941 and into January 1942, as the Soviet counteroffensive transformed the strategic situation on the Eastern Front. What had begun in October as a German drive to seize the Soviet capital ended with Army Group Center in retreat, its formations battered and demoralized. The reversal shocked both sides. For the Germans, it was the first large-scale strategic defeat of the war. For the Soviets, It was proof that the Red Army could not only withstand the most powerful army in Europe, but also push it back. The Soviet counteroffensive began on 5th December with simultaneous blows north and south of Moscow. In the north, the Kalinin Front attacked toward Klin and Kalinin, striking the German 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups. In the center, Zhukov's Western Front targeted the salient around Solnekhnogorsk and Narofominsk. To the south, the Bryansk and Southwestern Fronts attacked the overextended 2nd Panzer Army near Tula. Soviet forces numbered around 1.1 million men, supported by 774 tanks, 7,500 artillery pieces, and 1,000 aircraft. The Germans, with fewer than 1 million men in Army Group Center and only about 500 operational tanks, faced overwhelming pressure. Their logistical crisis, shortages of fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing, compounded their inability to resist. The results were immediate. By 12th December, Soviet troops recaptured Klin and pushed German forces 100 kilometers to the west. The fall of Kalinin soon followed, collapsing the northern flank of Army Group Center. In the south, Soviet armies relieved the siege of Tula and forced Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army into retreat toward Orel. German units abandoned Kashira and Yelets under pressure from Soviet cavalry and tank brigades. In the center, the 4th Army, tasked with holding Narofominsk, was forced to withdraw step by step, yielding territory under constant Soviet assault. By the end of December, the Germans had been pushed back between 100 and 250 kilometers in various sectors. The turning point was not simply a matter of Soviet numbers. Operationally, Soviet commanders exploited German weaknesses with flexibility. Ski battalions conducted raids deep into German rear areas, cutting supply lines and ambushing convoys immobilized by snow and frost. Cavalry corps, deployed in the open terrain south of Moscow, penetrated gaps in German defenses, forcing retreats to avoid encirclement. Tank brigades, often small in scale but equipped with T-34s and KV-1s, supported infantry in breaking through defensive positions. This combination of arms marked a departure from the rigid counterattacks of the summer, reflecting adaptation born of experience. The German response highlighted their vulnerability. Many divisions were reduced to fewer than 5,000 men, half their authorized strength. Frostbite cases outnumbered combat casualties in some units. Estimates suggest over 100,000 men suffered frostbite by January 1942. Vehicles broke down in freezing temperatures, while artillery pieces failed to fire due to frozen lubricants. German attempts to regroup and launch counterattacks, such as around Rzhev and Yukhnov, faltered for lack of reserves and supplies. Commanders pleaded for permission to retreat to more defensible positions, but Hitler issued orders to hold ground at all costs. This directive resulted in desperate defensive battles, with units forced to cling to towns and villages under siege conditions. The impact on civilians was severe across the front. In towns liberated by Soviet forces, survivors emerged from hiding after months of occupation. Many reported executions, deportations, and requisitioning of food by German forces. In German-occupied areas still under retreat, civilians were caught in crossfire, subjected to scorched earth tactics, or forcibly evacuated. In Moscow, the mood shifted dramatically. Fear of imminent capture was replaced by cautious optimism as news spread of German retreats. Factories resumed more stable production, morale rose, and Soviet propaganda celebrated the counteroffensive as a historic victory. Politically, the turning point reverberated beyond the battlefield. In January 1942, Stalin ordered the continuation of offensive operations across the entire front, seeking to exploit German weakness. He hoped that coordinated attacks might destroy Army Group Center entirely. Soviet morale soared, and the Red Army's image among its people and abroad was transformed. In London and Washington, the successful defense of Moscow was hailed as a demonstration of Soviet resilience, strengthening calls for increased Lend-Lease support. The perception that Germany could be defeated in the East began to take hold. For the Germans, the retreat forced a re-evaluation of strategy. Hitler dismissed several senior commanders, including Field Marshal von Bock, and assumed greater personal control over military operations. He continued to insist that Moscow's loss was temporary and that Germany retained the ability to resume the offensive in 1942. Yet the reality on the ground contradicted this optimism. Army Group Center had lost over 500,000 men since the start of Operation Typhoon, with more than 130,000 killed, 35,000 missing, and the rest wounded or incapacitated. Hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces were destroyed or abandoned. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was broken. The Soviet counteroffensive did not destroy Army Group Center, but it decisively ended German hopes of a quick victory. The Red Army had proven capable of strategic coordination and sustained offensive action. Moscow remained in Soviet hands, and the German army, for the first time, was forced into a prolonged defensive posture. The turning point of December 1941, January 1942, thus marked not only the salvation of the Soviet capital, but also the beginning of a shift in the balance of the war. By February 1942, the front line stabilized roughly 150-250 kilometers west of Moscow, running through Lviv, Vyazma, and Orel. The Germans established defensive salients such as the Lviv Bulge, which would become contested for over a year. The Soviets, encouraged by their success, launched further offensives in the spring, though these often overstretched their logistics and led to heavy losses. Still, the essential outcome had already been decided. Operation Typhoon had failed, and the Wehrmacht had suffered its first strategic defeat. The turning point at Moscow demonstrated that the war on the Eastern Front would not be decided in a single campaign, but would evolve into a prolonged struggle of attrition, with resources, endurance, and adaptation determining the final outcome. By February 1942, combat operations around Moscow had entered the aftermath phase. The Soviet counteroffensive had driven Army Group Center back from the capital, pushing the front between 150 and 250 kilometers to the west. The Germans, having failed to capture Moscow, now sought to stabilize their lines and avoid further collapse. The Red Army, emboldened by its success, aimed to exploit German weakness and destroy large portions of the enemy forces through continued offensives. Both sides confronted new challenges. For the Germans, the need to hold exposed salients with exhausted troops. For the Soviets, the difficulty of sustaining large-scale operations in harsh winter conditions with limited logistical capacity. The Soviet leadership, encouraged by the December victories, overestimated the potential for further breakthroughs. Stalin and Stavka ordered broad offensives across the front, including operations by the Western, Kalinin, and Bryansk fronts, as well as attacks farther north and south. Their objective was to encircle and destroy Army Group Center, eliminate the Lviv, Vyazma, and Orel positions, and push the Germans back beyond Smolensk. In total, over 1.5 million Soviet troops were committed to the winter campaigns, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and 15,000 artillery pieces. However, many of these units were understrength, poorly supplied, and exhausted from earlier fighting. German forces, though battered, retained cohesion. Army Group Center still numbered about 1 million men, though many divisions had been reduced to half strength. The Germans entrenched themselves in defensive positions along key towns and rivers, forming strongpoints in Lviv, Vyazma, Gzhatsk, and Orel. Hitler's order to hold ground at all costs resulted in the creation of the so-called hedgehog defenses, where villages were fortified with bunkers, trenches, and artillery. Despite shortages of fuel, food, and winter clothing, these positions enabled the Wehrmacht to resist Soviet assaults. In January-March 1942, the Soviets launched multiple offensives. The Kalinin Front attacked the Lviv salient, while the Western Front struck toward Vyazma. Soviet armies achieved local successes, advancing through snow and forests, but lacked the mobility to exploit breakthroughs. Ski troops and cavalry penetrated German rear areas, threatening supply lines, yet German reserves and counterattacks often restored the front. Heavy snow and sub-zero temperatures limited Soviet logistics, with supply convoys often unable to deliver sufficient ammunition or fuel. Entire divisions suffered from frostbite and hunger as they advanced into sparsely supplied areas. One of the most ambitious Soviet operations of the period was the offensive toward Vyazma. Several Soviet armies attempted to encircle German forces by cutting their supply routes. Though they managed to penetrate deep into German rear areas, coordination problems and logistical shortages prevented full encirclement. German counterattacks isolated Soviet spearheads, resulting in heavy losses. The 33rd Army, for example, was cut off and destroyed near Vyazma, losing tens of thousands of men. Similarly, in the north, Soviet attempts to recapture Rzhev led to protracted fighting with little territorial gain. In the south, Soviet forces attacked Orel and Bryansk, aiming to push the Germans out of central Russia. Initial advances captured several towns, but German countermeasures stabilized the situation. Guderian had been dismissed in December, replaced by General Rudolf Schmidt, who reorganized the 2nd Panzer Army into a largely defensive formation. German units used prepared positions and concentrated artillery to blunt Soviet attacks. By spring, Soviet offensives in this sector had ground to a halt with high casualties and limited achievements. The humanitarian impact of these winter battles was severe. In liberated areas west of Moscow, civilians emerged from months of occupation to find villages destroyed, livestock requisitioned, and food supplies depleted. Many reported atrocities, including executions and deportations by German forces. In occupied areas still under German control, conditions remained harsh, with requisitions, forced labor, and shortages of food and fuel. Civilians endured extreme cold with little shelter, while partisans in the forests increased their activity, targeting German supply lines and spreading disruption. Casualties during the aftermath phase were heavy on both sides. Soviet losses in the winter offensives from January to April 1942 are estimated at over 1 million killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties, though lower, were also significant, with around 300,000 men lost to combat and frostbite. The disparity reflected Soviet determination to press attacks despite logistical difficulties, often at the cost of high attrition. The Germans, though unable to regain the initiative, benefited from their strong defensive positions and disciplined formations. By April 1942, the Soviet offensives had exhausted themselves. The front stabilized along a line west of Moscow, running through Rzhev, Vyazma, and Orel. The Red Army had failed to destroy Army Group Center, but had succeeded in pushing the Germans back from Moscow and ending the immediate threat to the capital. The Wehrmacht, though bloodied, held firm in its defensive belts, setting the stage for prolonged fighting in the central sector. The Rzhev salient in particular would remain a focal point of combat through 1942 and into 1943. For the Soviet Union, the aftermath of the Battle of Moscow was a mixture of triumph and tragedy. The defense and counteroffensive had saved the capital and marked the Wehrmacht's first strategic defeat, boosting morale at home and abroad. Yet the cost in lives was enormous, and the failure to achieve deeper breakthroughs showed the limitations of Soviet operational capability at this stage of the war. For Germany, the inability to capture Moscow ended hopes of a quick victory in the east. Army Group Center had been checked, its offensive power blunted, and the war had turned into a prolonged struggle of attrition. The winter of 1941-1942 thus concluded, with both sides bloodied but unbroken. The Red Army had demonstrated resilience and adaptability, while the Wehrmacht had shown that even in retreat it could hold ground effectively. The aftermath of the Battle of Moscow foreshadowed the grueling campaigns of 1942, where resources, endurance, and strategy would continue to decide the fate of the Eastern Front. The legacy of the Battle of Moscow was shaped not only by its immediate results, but also by its long-term consequences for both the Soviet Union and Germany, and for the course of the Second World War. Operation Typhoon, conceived as the decisive blow to end the Soviet campaign of 1941, ended in failure. Instead of victory, Germany suffered its first major strategic defeat, and the Red Army emerged strengthened in morale, organization, and international reputation. The outcome altered perceptions of the war across the globe, demonstrated the limits of blitzkrieg, and revealed the capacity of the Soviet Union to adapt and survive under extreme conditions. From the German perspective, the failure before Moscow forced a reevaluation of strategy. The Wehrmacht had advanced over 600 kilometers from the border, destroyed dozens of Soviet armies, and inflicted millions of casualties, yet the Soviet state endured. Hitler and the German High Command had underestimated the depth of Soviet manpower reserves, industrial capacity, and will to resist. The expectation of a short campaign collapsed. By January 1942, Army Group Center had lost more than 500,000 men, thousands of tanks and guns, and the confidence that had characterized its early victories. The myth of invincibility, cultivated during the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans, was shattered. Soldiers' diaries and reports from officers conveyed the shock of retreat under conditions of cold, exhaustion, and Soviet counterattacks. The consequences for German strategy extended into 1942. Hitler dismissed or reassigned several commanders, including von Bock and Guderian, and increasingly involved himself in operational decision-making. He continued to insist on holding territory at all costs, forbidding retreats even when tactically necessary. This directive stemmed directly from the Moscow experience, where he believed that holding firm had prevented a larger collapse. Yet this approach locked the Wehrmacht into costly defensive battles in salients such as Rzhev, where hundreds of thousands more soldiers would perish in 1942-1943. The failure to take Moscow also forced the German leadership to redirect its efforts toward the south, where the oil fields of the Caucasus became the new objective. The 1942 summer offensive, leading ultimately to Stalingrad, was in part a consequence of the recognition that the Central Axis had been lost as a decisive theater. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Moscow carried enormous symbolic weight. The survival of the capital preserved the seat of government, the coordination hub of the Red Army, and the heart of Soviet communications. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow during the crisis of October and his speech at the Red Square Parade in November became central elements of Soviet wartime memory. The successful counteroffensive in December 1941 demonstrated the Red Army's ability to fight not only defensively but also offensively, contradicting earlier German assumptions that Soviet forces lacked initiative. The victory was publicized extensively. Soviet newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films presented the defense of Moscow as proof of the superiority of socialism and the unity of the Soviet people. Internationally, the legacy of Moscow influenced the course of Allied cooperation. In Britain and the United States, the news of Soviet success challenged earlier doubts about the USSR's ability to withstand the German invasion. Winston Churchill praised the Red Army's defense, and discussions of a second front in Europe gained momentum, even though it would not materialize until 1944. Lend-Lease aid, already under discussion, expanded significantly after the winter of 1941-1942. Convoys carrying trucks, aircraft, raw materials, and food began to arrive in larger numbers, providing support that, while modest compared to later years, contributed to sustaining Soviet logistics. The image of the Soviet Union shifted from a victim struggling to survive to a partner capable of defeating Germany in the field. The human cost of the battle was immense and formed part of its legacy. Soviet casualties during the Moscow campaign are estimated at 650,000 to 1,000 killed, wounded, or captured between October 1941 and January 1942. German casualties numbered approximately 500,000 over the same period, including frostbite victims and those lost to supply failures. Civilian losses, though harder to quantify, were also vast. Villages on the approaches to Moscow were destroyed in fighting or reprisals, and tens of thousands of civilians perished from exposure, starvation, or execution. The memory of this suffering became a lasting part of local and national narratives, with memorials and commemorations established in the post-war years to honor both soldiers and civilians. The battle also reshaped Soviet military doctrine. The Red Army recognized the importance of depth in defense, coordination of arms, and the use of reserves at decisive points. The experience of counterattacks around Moscow informed later operations, including the planning of encirclements at Stalingrad and Kursk. The successful integration of new technologies, particularly the T-34 tank and Katyusha rocket artillery, confirmed the value of Soviet industrial relocation and production. Moscow became a proving ground where lessons of failure and adaptation combined into strategies that would be refined in later campaigns. On the German side, the lessons were interpreted differently. The Wehrmacht continued to believe in the operational effectiveness of armored thrusts, but the experience before Moscow revealed the danger of overextension without adequate logistics. Nevertheless, Hitler remained convinced that determination and willpower could compensate for material shortages, a belief that would contribute to costly decisions in 1942-1943. The refusal to allow retreats, first imposed during the Moscow battle, hardened into a general principle that trapped German armies in later encirclements. In cultural and historical memory, the Battle of Moscow became one of the central events of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet historiography emphasized the heroism of soldiers and civilians alike, presenting the defense as a turning point comparable to Stalingrad and Kursk. The battle was commemorated annually with parades and ceremonies on Red Square. In the West, it was recognized as the moment when Germany's expansion was first checked and the tide of the war began to shift, though the decisive nature of the Soviet victory was sometimes overshadowed by later battles. The long-term significance of the Battle of Moscow lay in its demonstration that the Eastern Front would not be decided in a single campaign. Germany's failure to capture Moscow meant that the war in the East became a prolonged conflict of attrition, requiring enormous resources and costing millions of lives. For the Soviet Union, survival in 1941 ensured the continuation of its war effort, the recovery of its industry, and the eventual buildup of overwhelming strength. For the Allies, it signaled that Germany could be defeated and reinforced the necessity of a global coalition against the Axis. In the final analysis, the Battle of Moscow was more than a clash of armies. It was a confrontation of strategies, economies, and political systems under extreme pressure. The German attempt to deliver a decisive victory by seizing the Soviet capital collapsed against the resilience of Soviet mobilization, the brutality of winter, and the limits of German logistics. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 not only saved Moscow, but also altered the trajectory of the war.